Good. Okay. Good morning, everybody. Today is Monday, September 13th, and this is the task force on the implementation of the pupil weighting factors report. Thank you for joining us. We are in a different room today. We have different microphones, which hopefully are projecting well out into the Zoomosphere. And we have one member who's remote and another who will be joining us soon. But everyone else is here. So we're going to get started. Our first witness is Abby Shepard from the Legislative Council. Take it away, Abby.
Great. Good morning. So just for the record, Abby Shepard, Office of Legislative Council. Online, there is one document for me that's very short, and it provides the current statute on the property tax yields. So I will just be giving you a brief context and just overall background on what those two subsections mean and how they fit into the property tax calculation overall. They look simple and short, but in fact they interact with the other sections of the statute and session law, which is enacted every year by the General Assembly. So the first, so actually to take a further step back, the reason why there are two yields is because there are two types of property taxpayers, those who pay based on property value and those who pay based on income. So there's the property dollar equivalent yield, which is for those who pay based on property value, and the income dollar equivalent yield, which is for those taxpayers who pay based on their income. Both of these are in the property tax chapter 135 and Title 32. As I mentioned, there are 8 other sections of statute that interact with these yields to end up in what is the tax rate that a taxpayer will ultimately pay. The other title is Title 16, which is the education title. The yields, which I know that you have other witnesses who will provide you really useful flow charts and other background on this, but the yields are set each year by the General Assembly in session law. There is, and this actually was enacted just a few years ago, a default yield. So if the General Assembly does not take any action to set the yields, the prior fiscal year's yields will apply. So as I said, there are two types of property taxpayers, those who pay based on property, those who pay based on income. The variable, so that you have your base rate, which is set in statute, it's multiplied by the per pupil spending. So that is the variable that, one of the variables that changes the tax rate. That per pupil spending is divided by the yield. The yields are defined, and again, you have these definitions up there, but I'm going to try and pull it apart because almost every expression and word that's used in here has its own definition in statute. So the yields are defined as the amount of spending per pupil, per equalized pupil, that would result if the homestead tax rate were $1 per $100 of equalized education property value. So the starting point for setting the yields assumes that there's a stabilization reserve within the education fund that is maintained at 5%. And there's a process by which that is determined. It is included in the recommendation from the Commissioner of Taxes, which is otherwise referred to as the December 1st letter, which assumes that the education funds, sorry, let me just pull out my language here, because it's very precise, that the education funds stabilization reserve is maintained. Okay, so there are so many different sections. Here we go. That the statutory reserve is maintained at 5%, and it shall not exceed 5% of the prior fiscal year's education fund appropriation. So whatever was appropriated in the prior fiscal year, that the 5% is based on those appropriations. So the way that and again, you'll have both Brad James and Mark Thoreau from JFO going through how it all fits together. Again, the variable that increases the local tax rate is the per pupil spending, and that's referred to as the spending adjustment, which is also has its own definition both for the property taxpayers and the income-based payers. The property tax spending adjustment is a calculation I won't read to you, but I did just want to point out that it includes the excess spending. And as well as the income-based funds. However, again, it's that's based on what is also set in a different section of statute that is based on 2% as opposed to a $1. So I'm going to stop there because I'm getting too deep into the calculation. I don't want to confuse anyone. But my main points here are that there are many different areas of statute that are impacted by the yield, and the yield fits into that larger question. So I will pause there and take any questions because I know we're going to go much more into detail, but just wanted to see if there are any questions.
Representative Kornheiser.
I just wanted to reflect and appreciate that what you said about the fact that basically every single word in the statutory language has linked statutory definitions that I understand you don't want to show us because we would all get lost in the treasure hunt that you were on to construct this testimony. But I think that's really important for me to remember because I think the task of this task force is to work with one of those levers, and we don't spend very much time talking about all of the other levers, but those are all also defined in statute.
That's correct.
Senator Brock.
This is something I know that I've raised before, is the complexity of what we're dealing with is not understandable to most humans. And to that end, being able to graphically display what's happening on one piece of paper, Brad James did a great job of taking education financing and doing that some time ago. And I wonder if it might be possible to take what you're going to talk about today, particularly with respect to the yield, and do the same thing so that we can actually see it in what is essentially a flow chart with references back to its origin, to be able to understand what in fact is going on. And that I think would be very helpful to all of us.
Yeah, so I do believe that Brad does have a flow chart for tonight. I don't know if that's the one that you're referring to, but would you like me to just insert the statutory references?
If you can, yeah, if you can.
Because I did begin this presentation just by cutting and pasting all of these sections of statute, and it was about 6 pages long.
Yeah, I think Brad did such a great job on it. I think we're next going to ask him to outline Act 250 for us in the same way.
Certainly, I've thought.
Yeah.
I had asked him.
Yeah.
Senator Hooker, is that online?
This is,
Is
Brad sent this to us.
Did you, is it posted?
I'm not sure, Sorcha.
Oh, you just gave it to Sorcha.
That's last thing you want to send over.
Okay,
I did not post those for Brad because they were for a different meeting, but I can add whichever document. If Brad, you'll just tell me which one.
yeah, the flow chart would be
Do that.
great. But the flow chart, I don't have it up in front of me, but does it include the yield calculation part of it? Part of the process?
Sorry, I saw something that was online that included the yield. It just didn't have
It
statutory.
mentions it.
Equalized people, that's.
Yeah, it
doesn't-
mentions
yeah,
it, but
it
it
doesn't
doesn't provide
include
the
the-
detail.
Okay,
This
I'm
is
sorry.
what they're asking for, Senator.
Yes,
something
it is.
more
Something
detailed.
like
Sure.
that.
Yeah.
Fine. So you did do the 1.5 pager
I did.
that
and that's
for
part of
Senator
what I was-
Brock. Did you have that?
Yeah, and that was
on?
very helpful as well.
Okay, great. I
Is
can
there,
share that
could
with
you
for sure.
share that with everyone too? I think that's helpful.
Yep.
It's not as clear as the flow chart, but it's very helpful.
Sure, absolutely. I'll send that to Sorcha.
Thank you. Are there other questions for Adam? Representative Beck.
Just a comment mostly, and just for the, the task force education. The yield is applied to a district's entire pupil spending, when only about 30% of that pupil spending is supported by the Homestead taxpayers, which causes a rate equity problem amongst districts, which maybe we'll have some more time to explore later on.
So just to follow up on that comment, there, you mentioned that there are 2 types of taxpayers. There's the payers that pay on property and the payers that pay on income. There's also the non-homestead tax. There's sort of 3
Yes,
types.
I'm sorry. This is,
No,
my
that's okay.
discussion is limited to the homestead properties because the non-homestead is just a flat tax on the value.
But is that are those taxpayers included in the calculation of?
On the grant list,
On
and
the-
that is, that does go into the ultimate setting of the
Sure.
Because of also all of the expenditures from the ed fund.
As does every other revenue source.
Exactly, the non-property.
Do you have a breakdown of the percentages, like a circle chart? What are those called?
Pie
Pie chart, thank you. Do you have a circle chart of that?
I think Mark-
Mark might have that, okay, great, awesome, thank you. Do you have more to share with us?
That is the extent of my presentation on the yields. I was trying to keep it fairly limited because it immediately touches on, it's part of this larger whole.
Okay,
But that is, and I will be happy to send my 1.5 pager.
perfect, that's great. Senator Perchlik.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I don't have a question for Abby. I wondered if I could ask Representative Beck to elaborate on his point.
Sure.
Okay,
I understood what you said, but I didn't kind of understand when you said the equity consideration.
yeah, I'll try to put it into words. It's a lot easier to show with a graph, but. So basically, the yield is applied to a district's pupil spending amount, which gives a tax rate for the district. But only about 30% of education spending is supported by a homestead property tax rate. So what that does mathematically is, if you're a low spending district, your rate, the rate that district receives is significantly higher than what would be necessary to support that level of spending. If you're a high spending district, the rate that district receives is significantly lower than what would be required to support that level of spending. So effectively, what you have is you have your lowest spending districts paying a rate premium, if you want to call it that, and your highest spending districts receive a rate discount for their homestead payers. Bottom line is you get more rate value as you spend more money. To the disadvantage of your lower spending districts and to the advantage of your higher spending districts.
Just to be clear on the 30% is because we have all the other education revenue.
That's right. Right. The non-homestead, the consumption taxes. Yeah, right.
Joining us, Representative Conlon, you're here in person.
Happy to be here.
Excellent.
I'll try to pull up a graph that demonstrates it, which is much easier to see.
Right.
So we just heard a little bit about the yield. Do you have any questions for, okay. And you're going to stick around and yes, you have more questions. Okay, awesome. Thank you so much, Abby. And next we have Mark Pearl.
Good morning, everybody. I'm, for the record, Mark Peralt from the Joint Fiscal Office. Before I jump into my testimony, it occurred to me, based on what you're talking about right now, that it may be helpful if you guys had me come in and walk you through the education fund public. It touches on all these kind of issues.
Have you never done that for us?
I don't think I've ever done it.
Oh.
We've done it in ways and means many times, but I don't think it's ever happened here.
Can you do it right now?
I can come back this afternoon and do it. I just
Okay.
print out some.
We'll talk at the break.
Stuff like that. We can
Okay.
do it. So for this morning's presentation, I'm going to focus a little bit on the tax rate implications of a transition that you might be going through and what would happen to some existing law. This afternoon, I'm going to come in and talk more about how categorical aid, how pupil weighting actually affects the homestead property tax rate. But I'm going to put that off till this afternoon. So this morning, I'm going to start off by talking about two statutory provisions that are in current law: the excess spending threshold, 3.5% hold harmless provision. And then I'm going to talk a little bit more about some ideas about transitioning tax rates down the line. You don't have any recommendations out yet on what those rates might look like. So we haven't actually tried to model anything, but in abstract, I can describe some of the ways you can go about doing this. So the excess spending penalty is a provision that's been in the law for a number of years now. It provides that if a district spends over a certain threshold, they're going to pay an additional tax on the amount over that threshold. And I can go through the calculations for you if you want at some point, but what's important right now is just to understand that if you make significant changes in the pupil weights, it's going to have implications for this provision of the law. Now, last session, in anticipation of this, the excess spending threshold was suspended for FY22 and FY23. the threshold, they're gonna pay an additional.
That's weird.
It would come back into effect in FY '24. So if you're making significant changes in the rates, it's possible that some districts that have, maintain their spending below the threshold intentionally could be kicked up over that threshold simply because of the way you've changed the pupil weights. And that would exacerbate any change in the weights, pushing their homestead tax rate up. On top of on top of the change from their existing weight to the new weight, you have this additional penalty on top. And just to give you a sense of how big it is, let me just back up for a minute, just tell you quickly how it works. So the base year for measuring the excess spending threshold is calculated every year, and it's based on FY '15 statewide average spending, and it's increased by inflation. And then if a district it goes over more than 121% of that threshold, then they're going to pay that tax. They're going to pay twice on the amount over the threshold. In FY '22, the threshold is 18,789 per equalized pupil. And if it had been in place, it would have affected 16 districts, and they would have paid in about an additional $1.8 million into the fund. Brianna Parker did some analysis on this earlier this year, or this summer, and she looked at who was hitting the threshold in light of the recommendations in the report about who would get additional tax capacity and who would get less. And it's about split. So back in the session, we were anticipating that some districts may be going over the threshold simply because they may have, their pupil count may be too low. But it's a mixed bag. There's some in both camps. So it only actually have affected 7 districts that would actually lose capacity. But again, that's going to change from year to year. One other thing that Brianna identified was that there are about 36 districts that are close. So they're hovering below that threshold. So it's those districts, in other words, it's a bigger problem than just the 7 that we've identified that we go over now or are going over now. It's possible that a number of more districts that are just hovered below that level would kick over. So the policy consideration for the task force is whether you want to continue the suspension, eliminate the piece altogether, or modify it in some way if you want to avoid that additional burden that would be placed on so high spending districts as a result of the change. So that was kind of quick, but any questions on that part?
Are there any questions on the threshold? Representative Cornhusker.
Have there been any studies done over the last 20 years of this conversation about the districts that sort of make the decision to be right up against the edge and not go over? And how much that is because basically on how well the threshold works to do whatever it was intended to do.
Yeah, I mean, I don't think we've ever looked at it in a formal way. I know anecdotally, there's sort of a general understanding that districts do pay attention to this. Brad may be able to weigh on this because he deals with the business managers on a regular basis when they're developing their budgets. I personally think that they pay attention to it because they're already high tax, and this is adding more on top of that. So I think they do pay attention to it. The only other thing I wanted to mention on this is that this is one provision that, as a transition piece, this is not really a transition piece. This is just a consequence of changing the weights that it has implications for, tax rate considerations. So, okay.
Senator Perchley.
Thank you. When the excess spending threshold was added, was there ever a discussion about the difference between a district that's excess spending because they're building an Olympic-sized swimming pool versus a district that's excess spending because they need another math teacher? You know what I mean?
No, but I kind of glossed over exactly how it works. It's actually it's the education spending minus a number of different spending categories, mainly categorical aid. And there's been a lot of churn around that about what's included and what's excluded. Okay. Like a lot of things, it's become more complicated over time and there's been additions, but otherwise, no, I don't think that. It's just we have local control. We don't get into what districts actually spend the money on. As long as it's a legitimate education expense.
But yeah,
Representative Conley.
just a comment for the committee, and that is that of the 36 who are kind of hovering, many of them would have been over had it not been for pretty significant budget surpluses as a result of the pandemic aid and pandemic less spending.
So just to, when we took some testimony earlier in our time, earlier in the summer, and there is a chart on our website that I think it was Brianna's.
Yes, that's what I was referring to.
Yeah, exactly. So if you want to check back, it was I think in our July meeting.
Mhm.
And just, I think your anecdotal evidence, and Brad can probably confirm or deny this, but just having been a school board member, I think school board members do pay attention to the threshold and know exactly where it is in their budgeting, especially districts that may be close to it. So I think that, that is true. And I also just want to say, because I didn't say this at the beginning, that this morning we're talking about potential means for transitioning into whatever new thing we may or may not do, and how to ease that transition for some districts or all districts. So that we're just looking at a bunch of tools. So the yield is one of them. The threshold is a potential one. There are others that some work better or worse. So that's sort of, keep that in mind as we're thinking this morning of like, how do we ease into the transition or not? But those are some considerations for this morning.
Right, so one of the consideration on the high spending threshold is that it's possible that changing the pupil weights could end up being a cost driver. And that's because to the extent that it's successful in bringing up spending in some districts that aren't spending enough now on their at-risk kids, or things that are come up, Act 60, Act 68, other changes we've made in the past, spending is sticky coming down. So to the extent that the districts that lose tax capacity don't actually bring their budgets down, that's going to be pressure overall, the whole statewide system to increase spending. If you take away the excess spending threshold entirely, you wouldn't have any control over that at all. So that's, those are the kind of policy considerations you're going to have.
Can you say the first half of what you just said one more time?
Sure. So it's possible that changing the pupil weights could end up being a cost driver statewide. And that is because it's likely that the districts that gain capacity are going to spend more. And I think that's what you're intending. You'd like to see some of these districts spend more money on their at-risk kids. It's also true that at the high spending end, even though they lose tax capacity, they're not likely to bring their budget all the way down to where they would maintain a tax rate. So those two things combining together could be a cost driver going forward. We don't know. We don't know what districts are going to end up spending. It's a concern for people about eliminating the excess spending threshold entirely. Districts seem to pay attention to it.
The excess spending threshold, you may have already said this, but I just want to make sure I remember it correctly. It's based on, it was started in, the base year is FY15, right? And
Yes.
It increases each year by by inflation. And then is it education inflation or?
It's the state and local government price inflator that we use for everything else in education.
Okay, and then it is, the threshold is essentially 121%
Of that number.
of the FY15 inflated rate or amount. Is that correct?
Yeah.
So one potential thing, if we are to re-implement the threshold, is to change the base year and bring it up a bit. As a potential, or change the percentage. 21% is fairly arbitrary.
Or change the exclusions, because as I mentioned, it's not the education spending number that we base the tax rates on. There's a number of subtractions.
Right, and then one of the exclusions actually is construction costs. So if you are building an Olympic-sized pool.
Yes.
No.
No. Okay.
So it's only certain kinds of
Oh, okay,
construction,
thank
right?
you.
It's construct, my memory of hearing testimony about this, I think during the session, was that it's construction on the main building, but outlying.
It's going to be approved.
It has to be approved, and like fields and such are not part of that exclusion. And so I'm curious if we are going to think about how the excess spending threshold is used to contain costs, but also might be really sticky and problematic as we're sort of initially transitioning to new weights, if we could think about other exclusions or which exclusions are still useful and which ones are making it sort of a meaningless policy tool at this point. And so, yeah.
Right, and again, over time, a number of additional exclusions have been added. Just like household income, it gets more complicated over time because you run into individual situations that are difficult, so.
And exclusions are a very useful political tool that we toss, we toss into the garbage can sometimes.
Right, right. So, Senator Perchlik.
Thank you. Mark, none of your handouts talk about these exclusions. Do they?
No, I actually don't have anything. I can post my talking points if you want. They weren't really cleaned up enough to present to you this morning, so. I do have a PowerPoint this afternoon, but I haven't put these put up. But Brianna, also, you can check out Brianna's issue brief that is posted up on there. She does have a little bit more discussion in there.
Okay, yeah.
Yeah, I just want to note that we had such a quick turnaround from last week's meeting to this week's meeting that our staff was scrambling and working throughout the weekend. So just thank you all for all the work you put in to get ready so quickly for this meeting. And especially, I know Mark did a ton of work this weekend. So Representative Beck.
It's probably worth noting that in 2018, House Bill 911 left the House, went to the Senate, which ultimately a conference led to the Tax Structure Commission. That bill had a mechanism in it to eliminate the rate equity issue that we discussed earlier. And because that rate equity issue was addressed, there was no more need for the excess spending threshold, really. And it was eliminated in that bill, but did not make it through the Senate. Like I said, the Senate was not ready for that at that point in time. And they asked for the Tax Structure Commission at conference.
And we'll be hearing from one of the members of the Tax Structure Commission later this morning, actually.
But that language and that modeling has all been done. It's
any other questions? Okay, do you have more on this or?
Not on the high spending.
Okay.
threshold, the 3.5% hold harmless provision. It's similar in that there could be implications for this law when you change pupil weights. So I just wanted to go over a little bit. So the provision in general protects school districts with rapidly declining equalized pupil counts from significant changes in their homestead property tax rate year over year. This provision's had a number of changes over the year. I won't go into all of the details except to come back and talk about one of the issues that came up with it. But right now, last session, this provision was extended to all school districts. It had been limited after Act 36 to just districts that voluntarily merged. But at this point, all districts are eligible for it. The issue that I referred to is when this prior to FY17, the hold harmless provision was based on prior year hold harmless count. So in other words, if you were limited in coming down, the measure for the next year would be at that hold harmless number, okay, rather than your actual pupil count. And if you think about it, if you had consistently declining enrollment over 3.5% over time, you'd never catch up, right? And you continually have more what we called at the time phantom pupils that you're giving credit for in your equalized pupil count that you don't actually have. So a change in the law was made so that the measure of the 3.5% was based on the prior year's actual pupil count as opposed to the hold harmless count. And that eliminated the problem of these phantom students accumulating in different districts. Now, for your purposes here and for the policy considerations here, the issue is that this would act in effect as a transition provision if districts had significant increases in their or significant losses in their pupil count. But it would only protect them for 1 year. Because in the second year, you'd be looking back to the actual count and not the hold harmless count. So if it was in effect 1 year of benefit for districts that lost pupils, if they lost more than 3.5% of their kids, but beyond that, they'd be right back where they would have been anyways. So it doesn't really work as a transition provision long term. You could change the law so that you went back to measuring from the hold harmless number to where you are in the current year, and that way it would string it out over time. But it would affect different districts differently depending on how fast you're going to come down in terms of pupil count.
Representative Kornheiser has a question.
So the sort of policy goal thoughts around the original hold harmless provision was about loss of actual students. And so the tool is really designed around, around that. And so if we want to, because we didn't see that many fluctuations in weights, or the demographics of students. And so if we want to try to use this tool to modify it to meet the needs of a real change in student numbers related to the weights, then we're going to need to modify it a little bit, but then we might come up against the phantom student problem again.
Correct. So if you went back to the prior law, it would act more as a transition provision, but then you'd have the same problem you had initially for districts that are losing kids for other reasons, and you would accumulate these phantom kids. So the other thing is, again, this doesn't do anything about districts going up. Districts are going to go up and down. This only deals with districts going down, right? Pupil count.
What would happen if we, sorry,
No, go ahead.
if we constructed it in both directions? If it was a hold harmless and a hold harmless.
Okay, yeah, I was going to get to that. in the next
Oh, sorry.
section. No, it's fine.
Go for it.
That's the kind of thing I was trying to get to, is sort of getting these two statutory provisions out of the way and doing it. So if there's no questions on the excess spending penalty, I know we've gone over it a couple of times. I'll move on to the last.
Are there other questions on the current hold harmless? Or, I mean, it's. Yeah, okay, go ahead.
So a third option is just to try to transition over time in some way. And the initial advantage of this is that you could design a transition provision that slowed districts from coming down as well as from going up, and as opposed to just addressing one side or the other. And I looked back over the legislation that we've passed over several years, Act 60, Act 68, Act 46, and didn't really see any of the transition provisions that were in those bills that would be useful here. But we have done this kind of thing before when we've made changes in law and wanted to ease the impact. We don't have any actual recommended rates right now to model, so it's a little bit hard to talk about this in the abstract, but you could design a number of different things. One way to address this would be simply to say, you're going to phase in rates over 3 to 5 years, and you would have if it was 5 years, you'd have a 20% increment every year. The issue with that, in my mind, is that some districts are going to have a relatively minor change, right? They're going to be, a penny above or a penny below where they are right now in terms of tax rates, and other ones would be very far out. So stretching that out over 5 years for districts that have a relatively insignificant impact on the tax rates may not make sense. So you could exclude, districts that have, you could include in this provision only districts that exceeded some threshold for tax rate increases from year to year. You could also just put in a provision that said tax rates shall only go up or down by a certain amount every year. There was a similar provision to that in Act 46 that you could use, and could limit it to the number of pennies coming down, the percentage that you come down. There's a whole different range of things to look at. I think it would make a lot more sense once you have some preliminary recommendations in terms of tax rates. We could actually model different provisions, and you could sort of see what the impact would be on different districts. Right now, the modeling that was done by Chloe Wexler for FY20, the tax rate changes are very significant, like over 50 cents one way or the other. So you get you might have a very different look if you're going with those rates rather than something more modest in terms of changes.
There are questions about this? Did you have a question? Okay, Representative Beck.
I don't know if you mentioned it, Mark, but one thing you could do too is you could just eliminate the whole harmless provision and just go to a 3-year EDM average instead of 2, and just dampen it out that way.
Yep. So I was speaking with Mark just before the committee met about this. I actually think it doesn't make sense to do it on an ADM. Actually makes sense to do it on equalized pupils, because that's what's used to set the tax rate. And you can do it over 3 or 5 years, depending on how much you want to smooth it. Because the weights change the number of equalized pupils, I think it also is more logically
And you could do it either way.
tied to equalized pupils.
Right.
Do
it either way.
But it essentially would be doing what you're saying, which is,
Right,
is shifting the tax rate, the tax rate.
That's right. Really what you're trying to get at, though, is you're trying to mitigate the tax rate impact in towns, and it would be a lot more transparent if you had the provision apply to the tax rates as opposed to applying to the weights, which would be very hard for people to follow. They'd have to follow the whole process along to understand how they were benefiting or not benefiting from the trade.
I wasn't suggesting applying it to the weights themselves, but to applying it to, like, if your district goes from 100, equalized pupils to 120 equalized pupils, you use 5-year average to smooth that out, and a rolling average, so every year it
Right.
changes.
It get complicated, because you have to change, every year you have a different pupil count to work with.
Yeah,
It's not that different from tax rate implications either, because you have to account for budgets growing and shrinking.
right,
So that even describing it the simple way I described is about a 5-year with 5 increments. Those, the size of those segments would vary depending on what the budget was doing.
right.
But you, at the end of the 5-year period, at the end of the 3-year period, you'd be there
Mhm.
at that point. But again, because the changes for the districts are going to be all over the map, some very significant, others not.
Mhm.
You might want to consider who applies to, who doesn't.
Right.
So,
Senator Perchlik.
The House Bill 54, I think it was, that didn't it have some kind of provision to fold in the changes in the tax rates over time? Do you remember what that was? Or do you remember, Mr.?
I don't, I mean, I think there was I think a 5-year transition, but I can't remember the mechanics of how that transition worked.
yeah, I don't.
I mean, it's pretty, when you look at the changes that could impact some of the districts with these weight, depending on what we decide is weights, it could be pretty significant, or could be insignificant, but we have to make sure we figure out how to transition.
Right. I just remember that the House committee had discussions on that and came up with a solution. So I wondered what it was.
No, we
No.
we didn't debate 54 in great detail.
Oh,
Representative James, make sure that you yell out to me if I miss you, if your hand's up, okay? I'm
Yep.
sorry, I had forgotten you were there, so thank you for your patience, and just, are you able to hear and follow along, okay?
Yeah.
Okay, awesome. Any other questions at the moment? Okay, go ahead, Mark.
I think that's it, unless you have any other questions.
Okay,
Again, we're working on starting to be able to model this for you
yes,
going forward, and to the extent that you've got something to look at eventually, we can model different scenarios that I've laid out. You can see what you think of them.
okay. So let's everyone mull this morning. We're gonna come back to sort of some preliminary decisions this afternoon, so we can start having Mark and Brad and Brianna and others model this for us, so we can see what our decisions mean in real numbers.
So just to really wrap up, you've got a policy decision around the excess spending threshold, you've got a policy decision around the 3.5% home promise. And then once you've got some weights to look at, you've got a decision about what kind of mechanisms you're going to put in place to transition the impact on districts over time.
Mhm. Great, well, thank you. We'll see you later more. Later more, okay. Next, okay, we have Deb Brighton. There she is. Good morning, Deb.
Good morning.
Thank you for joining us. You want to go ahead with your testimony? Or first, your name and all that?
Okay, I'm Deb Brighton, and I'm a consultant to the Joint Fiscal Office, but I was also a commissioner on the Tax Structure Commission, and that's what I'm speaking about now, is sort of the intersection between the recommendations of the Tax Structure Commission and your work, and sort of the transition, but also some of the issues that we talked about that relate to your work now. So the Tax Structure Commission was set up by the legislature in 2018 to look at the whole tax structure. There were 3 members. One was Steve Trenholm, who was in CPA in Essex Junction, Graham Klepner, CEO of Danforth Pewter in Middlebury, and I was the 3rd member. And our goal was to look at the different taxes in combination. But at one of our organizational meetings, Senator Brock came to point out that the prior Blue Ribbon Tax Structure Commission hadn't really dealt with education, and that should be a priority for us. So we considered it as a priority. We met for 36 times over 2 years, and we heard from all sorts of people with opinions about what needed to change, as you can imagine. And we submitted our report in January of this year. And it covered all taxes, but I'm going to just focus on where we got to on education. But what I wanted to do was start with how we got to where we are now so that you can understand why we recommended the changes. So I think my slides are up on the website in something called income-based education tax. And the first chart came also from my barn when I went back the last time to look for the history of Act 60, the Brigham decision. I found this other chart, chart 1. And so as you can see, the property tax on a house and its site was a much higher percentage of the income of the lowest income households. And it was a lower percentage of the highest income households, which is exactly the opposite of what we wanted to see. And so this has been an issue. The relationship, the regressivity of the property tax on a house has been an issue since pre-Brigham. And it was something that we tackled in Act 60 in responding to Brigham, not necessarily, more in terms of what we had been working on prior to Brigham. And so what we did essentially in Act 60 was giving households the option of paying their education tax either on their house value, a property tax, or an income based on their income. So basically we set up two parallel systems. And so the last time that I met with you, I explained that what we had did with the yield for property was basically to give every single district the same property value or the same property tax base behind the student. But we did basically the same thing with income. And I know Brad explained how these two rates were calculated, but I just want to show you this slide again in chart 2 to show you how parallel the two systems really were designed. So what you have is Brad's same property and income people. So you've got an example where the spending per equalized pupil is $15,844. This is chart 2. And then the second line is the step is to take that spending per pupil and divide by the yields, but there are two yields. So there's one column here showing you the property tax calculation, and the second column, the blue one, showing you the income calculation. So in both cases, you take that same spending per pupil and you divide by the yields. It just happens to be two separate yields. And then you come up with line 3, which is the spending divided by the yield. And then you multiply it by the base. For property, the base is $1. And so you end up with a rate of $1.40 on property. And on income, the base is 2%. So you multiply the spending divided by the yield by 2%, and you come up with an income rate of 2.3%. So they're exactly parallel. They both depend on the same spending per pupil in the district, and they go up or down as the spending per pupil goes up or down.
Deb, can I interrupt for just a second?
Yes.
This is Ruth. So the base the dollar base for the property makes sense. That seems like a logical amount, $1. Where did the 2% come from?
Because once upon a time, we set them to be equal. We started with, I think our rate was $1.10 at that point, and it was approximately, we looked at $1.10 and 2% of income because they sort of matched. If we had gone to 1% of income, we would have had a very different yield. We had one yield. And what we did was we changed the yield, we changed the base from 2% to 1.9% or whatever, and kept one yield. Okay, and now what we do is we keep the base the same and we have two yields. But anyway, the equivalent at the point when we had one yield was 2% and $1 or 1.10.
Okay.
So it's history. And I know that it seems sort of weird, why don't you just go to 1% and then the yield would be half of that.
I see. Okay, thank you.
Okay.
Are there questions at the moment? Okay, carry on.
Okay, so it looks really simple here, as though you would just go and you determine your spending per pupil in the district, and then you calculate your two rates and you choose the lower and you pay on that. But unfortunately, the way we do it now is not direct. So you pay what's in the first column. The first year you pay on your property rate. And then in the second year, the tax department looks at the difference between what you paid on property and what you would have paid had you paid on income. And it gives you a credit for the difference. And that comes in the second year. And part of that means that when people go to vote, they don't know exactly what it's going to do to their tax bill. And partly it means it's so disconnected that people don't understand what's really going on. But because of in spite of that, because the underlying system is basically there, we end up in what you see in chart 3. And this was done by Chloe Wexler a few years ago. But what it's basically showing you is the same thing as the first chart, which is that the income of homeowners is increasing along the horizontal axis. On the vertical axis, you see the tax rate as a % of income. The gray bar shows you what it would be if they were paying on their house site, the first column. And then the blue bar shows you what they end up paying after they've looked at the difference between the property tax and the income tax. So this is essentially forgetting about the lag in years on the credit and moving them both into the same year as they were originally thought of. And so what you see is that it's essentially flat in the middle income. And it drops off, it goes, drops down. The tax as a % of income drops down as you go higher up, over more than 150,000 or so. And that's basically because in the higher incomes, the property tax is less than what the income tax would be. So what we did was we kept those two things running parallel. We gave people the option. The option was clearly the income tax in lower incomes, and higher incomes is the property tax. But essentially, when we talked to people and heard testimony, the biggest complaint was complexity. It wasn't where we ended up. It was the complexity of the system, dealing with it, understanding it, and sort of the frustrations involved with the complexity. So we wondered, could we get rid of one of the systems? And we asked people why we were still dealing with the property tax, which we agreed was totally regressive. And we got a bunch of answers to justify use of the property tax. The first one was people assumed that the house value is a good indication of income because on average, people with higher incomes have higher value houses. But as you saw in the gray bars in the chart above, in terms of as a % of income, it is totally the wrong way to go. It's a much higher proportion of the income of the people who have the least ability to pay. But it's also true, as you can see in chart 4, that house values vary considerably in income categories. In other words, a house value is not a good indication of the income of the owner. If you look at, say, the green category of house value, you can see that a house value of that income, which is about average, house of that value, which is about average, has an equal chance of belonging to households in any income category. So in any income category, there's quite a range of house values at any point in time. So it's pretty clear that that's not a good indicator of income. But the second justification is that property tax on homes is a wealth tax, and that wealth is an indication of the ability to pay. And the commission did agree that the ability to pay is partly a function of income and partly a function of wealth. But when we looked at the value of a home as a surrogate for net worth, we found that it doesn't do well. If you go to chart 5, We don't have state data for this, so chart 5 is national data. And it shows the families grouped into quintiles by net worth. And so for each quintile, the purple bar shows you the median house value. The red bar shows you the value minus the mortgage. And the blue bar to the right shows the net worth of the median household in the quintile. So total net worth. So at the lower incomes, the house value often exceeds the total net worth. And that's basically because the house is mortgaged and they have fewer other assets. At the higher end, the house is a very small fraction.
I'm sorry to interrupt again. Representative Kornheiser has not a message, a question.
Can you build out the labels for the chart for me a little bit? Are these all $100,000 increments, and then the percentage of the total net worth? Is it the total of what? I don't know if I just haven't had enough coffee.
Country.
Is it the whole country?
Okay, so it's the total net worth in that quintile. And so essentially let's look at maybe the middle quintile so that you can actually see the height of the bars. You start having bars so that you see that the total house value is a higher percentage than, let's see, the height of the purple bar is higher than the height of the red bar, which is the house minus the mortgage. But that's nearly 100% of the height of the blue bar, which is very small in terms of the total net worth of the population. Okay, so it's only about, let's see, the blue bar is less than 10% of the total net worth of the population. So in this quintile, there's very low net worth compared to the total net worth of the public. It's of households. Basically, the highest total net worth is extremely high in the final quintile, as you can see, the blue bar. Okay, and that's almost like it's 70-something% of the total net worth. In other words, the distribution of net worth is much more extreme than the distribution of income. Okay, and the house value, although the value of the house increases as net worth increases, the proportion of your total net worth that's represented by your house value is really, really low at the low end. I'm sorry, the proportion of the house is high at the low end and much lower at the high end of net worth. And it's mainly because your house value represents your entire net worth at the low end, and it's only a fraction of your net worth at the high end because most of your net worth is financial assets or other types of real estate. Did that answer the question?
Yeah, it does.
Thank you.
Any other questions at the moment while we have a pause? Okay, carry on.
Okay, so, and I guess the last justification that we heard was that this is the way we've always done things. That the homestead property tax has always been in place. It's what we've always done, and an old tax is a good tax. And I mean, that makes some sense to explain why we still have it. But I did want to point out that in reality, our early property tax was much more tied to the ability to pay. So the grand list was a list of all things, all property that people owned to try to figure out what ability they had to pay. And it included things like cows, beehives, and wagons, as well as real estate. And the values were assigned by the state according to whether the property was necessary for survival, whether it was useful, or whether it was superfluous. So that cows of different ages had different values because of their usefulness. Wagons with bench seats were valued as useful, Well, if the wagons had springs under their seats, they kicked into the category of being superfluous and they had a higher value. So basically, we tried really hard to get an ability to pay. It just wasn't like a flat tax on houses the way it is now. So our current property tax on homes just doesn't meet the same goals. The main reason I think that we do it still is that other states do it. But the tax commission decided that since the primary problem that we found with our current tax structure was the complexity, that we would direct our residential, we would have a direct residential education tax based on income and essentially move to directly to something as close to where we were in the chart that showed where we ended up after the double process, but we would eliminate the double process. We would have one system because running two separate programs, income and property, with different schedules and different rules and different agencies of administration is really cumbersome. Worse, it actually requires a third system to coordinate the two. So we decided to go directly to income. And we also wanted to make sure that we didn't have a credit system. We wanted a direct system, no lag, nothing sort of where you pay one in 1 year and catch up in the second year. So it could be clear and direct. Finally, we decided we would include renters. We couldn't think of a principle-based reason that renters should be treated differently for education, which benefits everyone. And we felt that equal treatment may create a better match between the population of taxpayers and the population served. However, because renters are assumed to pay an education tax through their rent, they would receive a credit designed to offset that cost. So in our meetings, we received a lot of testimony that high income districts were spending more and that low income districts were unable to do so. And I think you've heard some of the same comments. And at the same time, when we were doing this, the weighting study had come out highlighting the cost of educating children from poverty. And so as a commission, we struggled to try to figure out what was a tax problem and should be addressed through the tax structure and what was really a cost problem. So first we investigated the hypothesis that high income districts spend more. And before Brigham, it was clear that high property values were spending more per pupil than low property value towns, and that was creating an unfair disparity. So our question was it true now that high income districts were spending more per pupil than low income districts? And we found that there was not a significant relationship. So we ran this using 2018 data when we were doing the report, but we also reran it. I just reran it recently using 2020 data. But we're finding the same thing, that there's not a statistically significant relationship. I'm sure there are examples, but basically it's not the trend.
Hold on just 1 second. We have a question. Sorry, I keep interrupting, but I think it's helpful to make sure we understand as you're going.
Yeah.
You have an amazing ability to drop these truth bombs in the course of just like a series of other sentences. And so I would love if you could talk a little bit more about that analysis that you just described.
Okay. So it was statistical, so I don't want to get too statistical here, but our hypothesis was that even though all districts have equal tax base behind them in terms of both property and income, that higher income people, let's say it's a town where we ended up with whatever it was, 2.3% of income in our example was the rate. So 2.3% of income may be much easier to spend if you're a high income person than if you're a lower income person. So the hypothesis would be that in higher income towns, more people found it easier to vote in the Olympic swimming pool or whatever it is than in a low-income town. So we analyzed the spending related to the median income and the mean income. We looked at the expenditures per ADM. We looked at the equalized spending per ADM, the equalized spending per equalized pupil by district, compared with the median income, compared with the average income. And then we also looked at it individually by all of the people who filed the Homestead Declaration, so that it was looking at, so anyway, that was looking at 130 something thousand people, their education and their income and their spending in their district, or in two districts if they happen to be in a place that belonged to two districts. And in all of those cases, there was not a significant correlation. It surprised me. It surprised us. But it was even more surprising because the next step we took was to look at the relationship between spending and poverty. And that was a significant relationship. And since poverty is related to income, in other words, you would assume that, well, it is true that there's higher poverty in areas where there's lower income in general. It was puzzling to us. So we found that high poverty districts were spending more per ADM than low poverty districts. And so that really got our attention. And so we looked into it more, and I reread what I had written about this in the report, and it is what Brad would call statistical gobbledygook. So I'm trying to explain this. Mark helped me figure out a way to maybe explain this. So chart 6 is an attempt to explain this puzzle. So what we did in this chart was to divide 5 quintiles, divide all the districts into 5 quintiles based on the percentage of poverty students. So there are 20% of the districts in each quintile. And the blue column, that's labeled column 1, shows the expenditures per ADM, which tend to increase as the poverty level increases. Okay. And then the next column, labeled column 2 to the right, shows the average education spending per ADM. So this is after subtracting the revenue that comes from categorical aid, federal aid, or other revenue. And I think Mark or Brad will get more into that later. But after you do that, after you subtract the categorical aid and those things, you end up with the education spending. And so when you look at that, it's fairly flat through the quintiles. Then the third column is the average education spending per equalized pupil. So it's the same spending, but we've incorporated in the third step the weights. Okay, we've gone from ADM to equalized pupil. And then the fourth column is where you end up with a tax rate, which comes directly from the third column, basically. So what you see is that the education spending per equalized pupil is lower as the poverty rate increases. So this sort of indicates that the weighting resulted in lower rates rather than an increased spending in the poverty districts. And for reference, I took the incentives out of this so that it's not getting blurred by the incentives, but the average district rate at this time was $1.57.
So Deb, I just want to make sure I'm understanding this. So this chart, what you just said was that the weights were actually, when you look at it in the weighted formula, they are resulting, as poverty increases, they're resulting in lower tax rates, not higher spending per pupil.
Yeah.
That is huge. That is huge because I think the goal is to spend more money on students in poverty. But what this chart is showing is that as poverty increases, those districts are just having lower tax rates. They're not actually spending that money on students in poverty.
That's right. They're not coming up to the average. But so that this is, now I have to leave the realm of statistics and say, this is what we pondered. Exactly the point that you're raising. Why is this happening? And maybe it's local control. Maybe part of it is just lack of clarity about what the bill is. So people just feel they can't vote. They just can't vote in something that they don't know exactly if they can pay for it or not. And it sounds like too much. But maybe the tax is still too high for lower income residents. But to look more at this before we offered any suggestions and conclusions. Another question?
Oh, yeah, hold on. Representative
Yeah.
James.
Thanks. I do have a question. I want to make sure I'm looking at this correctly. So as tax rates drop in this chart, that shows lower tax rates and lower spending per equalized pupil on for more students in poverty. But isn't that also local control by districts that have more families living in poverty?
Right.
Okay. So in other words, it's not just, oh, we're going to spend less on students who are in poverty. These are choices made by families who are in poverty.
Exactly.
Okay, thanks.
And so that's what we were trying to figure out, because families in poverty not being able to pay for things is a tax problem. The extra cost maybe is not a tax structure problem. So that was really where we had to leave the realm of statistics and kind of ponder what might be happening. But one of the things that we noticed when we dove into this is that, strangely enough, in the fifth quintile, the bottom row here, which is the 20% of the districts with the highest poverty, we have an interesting mix of towns. We have our biggest cities and we have our smallest rural districts. An odd combination. So we divided that quintile into two groups, pretty much in the middle, those with less than 500 students and those with more than 500 students, and that's chart 7. And I'd actually like to start with the bottom row, which is the cities greater than 500 students. This includes Burlington. So I'll just use Burlington as an example. Burlington has a high proportion of poverty students, a relatively low tax rate, yet the median income of taxpayers is above the statewide median of all districts. So in this case, there is a mismatch between what your question was, aren't these families in poverty also? There seems to be a mismatch. And that is true of most of the people in most of the districts in this group. It includes Rutland, Springfield, bigger cities. And I think it is due to the mismatch between the population of the taxpayers, it's only the homeowners, and the population with the kids in school, which includes renters. So there isn't a tight link between income and poverty in the cities. So that may explain why there would be a high poverty percentage and above average income of taxpayers in this group. So it indicated to us on the tax commission another reason why that income of homeowners wouldn't be the best way to address poverty. But that still doesn't answer the question of why these districts spend less per equalized pupil than other districts with the same incomes. Another possibility may be that these districts tend to have significantly higher municipal taxes. And because the municipal tax and the school tax sort of show up in one bill, the school budget may be constrained by the municipal tax bill. of the homeowners. But anyway, on the other half, it's the top row here, less than 500 students. There are a few things to note here. These small districts have lower expenses per pupil, per ADM, but they have lower offsetting revenue, like categorical aid. So they end up having higher equalized spending per ADM and they have, I'm sorry, per equalized pupil. They have higher tax rates in the larger districts, but their median incomes are lower. And unlike cities, they generate low municipal bills, so that's not a factor. But a thing that we did note on the tax commission is that the median income of this group is just slightly above the maximum for our homeowner rebate program. And that means that half of the taxpayers are below or just about at the range of our current rebate system. So in the smaller districts, you seem to see a much tighter connection between the poverty rate of kids in the district and the poverty rate of the taxpayers. So we came out that we agreed that targeted aid was necessary to address the cost of educating children in poverty, but also perhaps targeted tax relief for low-income homeowners should be considered. As Representative Kornheiser pointed out in an earlier meeting, the Constitution, it's Article 9, says that the purpose for which a tax is raised should be more of a service to the community than the money would be if not collected. And it seems that maybe this is something to consider, that if a family is in poverty and we're trying to address poverty, maybe leaving the family with resources rather than taking it in education taxes is a better approach. So part of our recommendation would be to address our current rebate program, homeowner rebate program. It gives tax relief to homeowners with incomes below 47,000. And I think it's been at 47,000 since pre-Brigham. And I can't even remember where we came up with 47,000, but I think it's worth looking at very carefully. If we're trying to address poverty, do we need to look at the incomes of the homeowners more carefully and make that connection clearer? And if I can sort of get back then to our overall changes, the ones that I think would be most helpful in dealing with this transition would be if you went to one system, it can make it vastly clearer so that people would know what their vote would be, given what their vote for a budget will do to their bill. And that we would have one bill, and that it would be clear that the higher the spending per pupil, the higher the tax bill, the lower spending pupil, lower the tax bill. So get rid of the credit, make it a direct tax so that there's no lag and follow up in the following year. But this is also more important when you're instituting a change, because in the first year in towns where there's an increase, say a decrease in pupils, an increase in rate, in our current system, they would have to pay that increase in their property tax rate before they would get the credit in the following year. This is the problem they're facing in Burlington now with the reappraisal. So getting rid of the credit and that lag would be really helpful. And the third thing would be to reevaluate the rebate program. And we would suggest looking at two things. One is changing the 47,000 income and figuring out a way to keep it in sync with, you know, our with poverty, with income and the ability to pay. And the second is to change the way that it works so that right now it's a cutoff, that when you reach a certain income level, your property tax is cut off at a certain point, no matter what you vote in. And I think that we felt that both for renters, that we need to have all of the people in the community with what we're calling skin in the game. And so even if they're paying a lower amount, it should go up or down. It should be affected by the spending per pupil. And right now we've lost both the renters And we've also lost the lower income people in terms of being affected that way. And so, of course, we would, the final piece is we think that you should include renters. That basically it has the advantage of bringing all of the people in the community into the process of deciding, not only voting, but also being affected by what they vote in. And of course, we want you to consider our whole package, but there are some pieces that you could take, some things that maybe you could learn from our deliberations, put into your considerations.
So to that point about the full package, Sorsha, I think is the tax commission report on our website. I think it's in the background information. Is that right?
I'll check.
Okay. I'm pretty sure it is, but if it's not, we should post that so people can look at your full recommendations to see
Thanks.
what those are as well. And I have, well, we'll go to Representative Beck. I have a question too, but we'll come back to that. Go ahead.
Hey, Deb.
Hey.
Did the Tax Structure Commission, did you do any historical analysis of the stability of moving to a system that just uses income versus a system that uses income and homestead property wealth? Did you look at the stability of one system relative to the other?
We did, and there's a chart that I couldn't pull up right now, but what surprised us was we had heard several people testified that, well, actually, I think it's just sort of common wisdom that the income tax is not stable, that the property tax is stable. And we looked at the base, not the amount of money that came in from each, but we looked at the base. And we found that actually the property tax in the past, the window that we looked at, I think was 15 years, was more stable. One of the reasons that we think that the income tax is more volatile is that we basically, when we set our budget, we don't know what the income tax revenue is going to be in the next year. So we set a budget and we kind of base it on estimates of what the income tax is going to bring in. And, you know, it's never exactly right. But the property tax, on the other hand, we have a budget and we set a rate to match it. You know, so that makes the property tax revenue more stable, but it's not that the base is more stable necessarily, it's that the rate we apply is more stable. The second piece is that we, when we budget, we essentially know our property tax. We know our property tax base. We don't know our income tax base until the income tax comes in. So one of the ways to make the income tax be more stable would be to do what we do with the property tax, and that is that take it from the value on the prior year. And so if you made those two changes, I think the stability would be about the same.
Thank you.
Are there other questions? Senator Perchlik.
Thank you, Chair. And Deb, do I remember correctly that the report suggests is to keep the non-homestead rate? Have an
Yes.
income and a non-homestead and get rid of the home?
Yes, yes.
So that would help with that stability, I would assume.
Yes, good point. Thank you.
So that was part of my question too. So just to carry it forward with that, the non-homestead properties include second homes and businesses and anything that's not a house that a primary resident lives in. Is that correct?
Yes, we would actually, so right now we have a house site, we have homestead rate, and we have a non-resident rate. And people can pay the homestead rate on something that's near their house, but it's not the house and 2 acres. In other words, if you had a house and 50 acres, you'd pay the homestead rate on 48 acres. The tax commission wanted to get rid of that sort of middle ground. And so you would just have a house site that could pay on income, and everything else would be non-residential.
So there would not be the 2-acre rule that in your recommendation? Is
That the
that-
house site
that
would be 2 acres, a house and up to 2 acres. And everything else would be non-residential. So your 48 extra acres around your house would pay the non-residential rate.
Okay, in your recommendation?
In our recommendation, yes.
Yeah, okay. And the income tax, if I'm remembering correctly, that you recommend in your tax structure report is like a local income tax. So it's based on the locality, is that correct?
Yes, it would be the same way that it's done now. It would be the spending per equalized pupil divided by the yield would give you the income tax rate in your district.
So it'd just be essentially the income-based portion of the yield calculation that we would be doing, not also the property tax part. Is
Right,
that,
so where we'd end up would look sort of like pretty much like where we already are. In other words, a lot of people right now are paying on their income, on their house and 2 acres. There would be no change in the net for those people. It would just be direct, a lot less confusion, a lot less paperwork.
got it, okay. There are other questions?
Yeah.
Senator Brown? Representative Brown?
Deb, did you run any hypothetical models? And one of the things I always hear about a fear of moving to an income, an education tax based on income is that you might chase some people out of the state that pay a lot of income tax into the general fund. Did you do any hypothetical models of what that might look like if that came true to some degree?
No, and I agree. I've heard it. It's always been a consideration. Right now, it's the reason why in the chart that you looked at, the blue bars went down. In other words, the tax bills went down as a percent of income for people with incomes greater than $150,000. Nobody wanted to create such a high education tax burden on high incomes that people would move out of the state. And so I don't know how to model that exactly, but I think it involves a database that we don't have at this point. We Joint Fiscal Office doesn't have at this point, which would be incomes associated with property values for higher income people who don't file their incomes for this program now. The same one that we're waiting on for your proposal.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's important to understand that, and also to understand that a lot of those high income earners, a lot of times those are just one-time events too. They're not people that actually have earned income of $1 million a year. So there's a lot there to unpack, and there's a lot of human behavior to predict, and of course, it's very difficult to predict human behavior.
Senator Brown?
Well, perhaps I'm asking the same question in a slightly different way. Did you project in any way what the effect on the marginal rate would be of the highest income taxpayer by virtue of this change?
All right, we didn't consider it as a surcharge on the personal income tax or something like that. It's a different base. It's an education tax. So we didn't add it to any marginal rate, but I think it's a valid question. And I think that if you looked at the effective tax rate, not really the marginal rate, but the effective tax rate on people of different incomes, and you looked at somebody with an income of, say, high income, say $500,000 or something, it would move that effective rate up about 2.3% or whatever the average is. I mean, it would be different in every district, but it would essentially do that. It would add 2.3% to the effective tax rate, not the marginal rate necessarily, but the effective tax rate. And I think though that you asked us before a question about had we looked at the different rankings of different states and what would this do to our ranking in terms of tax rates in different states. And we looked at all of the different ways, all of those different rankings. We spent a lot of time with it. We found that fewer and fewer now are just asking things like, what's your top marginal rate? Because I think that people know that you can hit the top marginal rate at different incomes and end up paying a very different effective rate, depending on not just the top marginal rate, but what you went through to get there and when the brackets changed and what the brackets are. And then also you may have states that have a high income tax, but a low property tax, or no income tax, but other kinds of taxes that make up for it, like New Hampshire. And so then more and more the indices are starting to look at hypothetical households and sort of the adding all of the taxes together. And I think that's what you see in something like ITEP, the national studies, where they just break households into quintiles and they show sort of what their overall tax burden is. And in that case, we're taking away your property tax on your house and you're substituting an income tax. So we would end up in about the same place for those kinds of indices that add everything together. So bottom line was, we ended up saying that's really the fairest way to compare taxes in one state and another, is to look at the cumulative tax burden rather than to single out one particular tax. Although I do understand your point, if you were the person who had a high income and a low house value, it would be a bad deal.
Representative Kornheiser.
I just wanted to respond to Representative Beck's question that I remember Graham Campbell from JFO presenting more than one study that wealth flight, while something that we have all personally maybe know one person who moved over the border or down to Florida because of taxes, is not a statistical reality in communities, which I was surprised to hear, and that we can ask Graham to come in or pull up those studies if we go deeper on this.
There are different opinions.
Sure.
Absolutely.
Sure.
Representative Conlon.
Oh, hi, Deb. I'm trying to get my arms around the impact of eliminating homestead property tax rates and making it all non-residential property tax rates. If we did that today under the current system, overall, would that bring in more money to the ed fund, and would people who own 6 acres, 10 acres, whatever it happens to be paying more or less, or would it be a distribution?
It would be a distribution, and it's very small amount. And although there are a lot of people who own more than 2 acres around their house, the bulk of the value is on the house and 2 acres. So it's not a lot of money difference.
Thank you.
Senator Persley.
Thank you. I don't have a question for Deb, but thank you for your testimony and your work over the years on these things, Deb. But just for the committee's sake, I really hope that the committee can work on this or include this issue in our report. I think it's a really important part if we're going to look at changing the weights, that we also look at changing the way the tax is collected. I really support the commission's finding on this point, and specifically around the renters, because we talk a lot about the income sensitivity, but it doesn't really affect the renters. We're all who are often the lowest income people, the Vermonters. So this is a way to bring that income sensitivity to the lowest income.
Are other questions or comments on this topic, or questions for Deb in particular? Okay, I'm sure we're going to have you back to talk. Well, Representative Kornheiser.
Can I visit your barn sometime?
Yes. Field trip to Deb's barn.
For these charts.
There's a lot of history in that barn.
Well, and I'm actually asking because I really hope that as we continue this conversation, we are documenting the reasons we are making specific sort of fiscal policy decisions, because I think so much of what's been hard as we've gone through this process is that we often don't remember how some of the decisions were made or why they were made for Act 60 or even before that. And so I'm just, hoping we can find a way to record that memory. So when things need to be tweaked in 5 years or 20 years, people will understand and not have to sort of reinvent the wheel on some of the thinking.
Yeah, absolutely.
I'm
Deb's
so
barn is
grateful
sort
for
of-
the barn.
Yeah, it's right between where Representative Codlin and I live, so we can meet at your house for a task force picnic. Okay, any other questions or comments for Deb while we have her here on screen? Okay, thank you so much. We will certainly come back to you with more questions and look forward to your modeling of some of our work as we move forward. I see Brianna popping up, but we are actually going to take a small break right now. And it's 10:34, so let's take, I think we have time for a 15-minute break. So come back at 10:50, 16 minutes, okay, guys? I will be on time, as will Senator Brock, and we'll see you in 16 minutes. Thanks again, Deb.
Thank you.